Last month, two young activists threw tomato soup at a Van Gogh painting, kicking off thousands of truly horrible hot takes that really just had me praying for Twitter to just die already. And that wish was granted. So, be careful what you wish for, guys. If, unlike me, you aren't poisoned by being extremely online at all times, and you missed this story somehow, basically, these protesters threw soup at one of Van Gogh's sunflowers paintings and then glued their hands to the wall next to it, shouting, "What's worth more, art or life? Is it worth more than food, worth more than justice? Are you more concerned about the protection of a painting or the protection of our planet and people?" These were protesters from Just Stop Oil. So they're protesting the fossil fuel industry causing global warming. And the video of this quickly spread around social media. And what I saw mostly was, at first, people expressing horror at someone destroying a work of art in order to make some kind of disconnected point about fossil fuels. I didn't bother to make a comment on it at first because it seemed like I had incomplete information. And it was nearly like an hour before I was able to find anyone confirming that actually, the painting is already protected behind glass, so the entire thing was fixed with a roll of paper towels, and the painting was back on display within hours. I'm honestly not sure how I would feel if they really had destroyed a painting that for some reason could not be restored, but with that out of the question, I can confidently say, okay, perfectly fine way to get attention for a just cause of stopping the fossil fuel industry from destroying the planet. And yes, I know, the planet will be just fine because it's just a fucking rock flying around space. Please leave your semantics arguments in freshman year debate club where they belong. Thank you. But it was interesting to watch people on social media learn in real time that the painting wasn't damaged because they were so angry at these activists, and they initially blamed their anger on the idea that a painting was destroyed. But now that they know that the painting is just fine, they're still angry. And so many of them were frantically just searching for a new reason to explain their anger. Like this guy who tweeted at me, "Not really much of a protest if nothing is at risk then, is it? Performative stupidity mostly. It's like protest light." And so I asked him point blank, if they had destroyed a Van Gogh, would you be on Twitter celebrating them then? But alas, no, because then he found a new reason to be angry. It's not that they destroyed a painting. It's not that they didn't destroy a painting. It's that it was a meaningless act perpetrated by idiots. If you're going to protest, it has to be meaningful, not symbolic. And honestly, I was just fascinated by this. People were now angry because the protest is meaningless or because they think it will have the opposite effect and turn people away from caring about climate change. But in the end, all of these angry people didn't actually care about the painting in the least. They were angry simply because, in my opinion, young people were doing something for a cause that they cared about. And the angry people know deep in their hearts that they do not have even a fraction of that kind of courage, that kind of conviction. And they know that the cause is a good one that should inspire us all to have that kind of courage and conviction. But instead of doing anything about it, we are at home eating our Cheez-Its and doom scrolling Twitter and channeling our guilt by getting angry at someone who's actually out there doing something. My hypothesis is that no protest that these young activists could have done would have been widely considered to be meaningful and also good and also effective. And despite that, there's a good chance that this protest will historically be seen to be all of those things. And that hypothesis is based on decades of research. As I said 2 years ago when talking about the Black Lives Matter protests, which had a lot of these same criticisms, I said in 1961, 57% of Americans said that sit-ins hurt the cause of those fighting against segregation. By 1963, that number had risen to 60%. By 1964, after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, 74% of people thought sit-ins were counterproductive. 3/4 of people thought that Martin Luther King had extreme actions that were hurting the civil rights movement. He was one of the most hated men in America. And yet, the civil rights movement largely succeeded. And even though 79% of people said that the LA riots were not justified, nearly 30 years later, scientists can see that those riots helped, quote, build support for policy by mobilizing supporters. They found that both white and African American voters were mobilized to register to vote, that new registrants tended to affiliate as Democrats, and that voters shifted their policy support toward public schools, net of a general shift in support for education spending. This mobilization appears to have persisted. Those mobilized by the riot remained regular participators over a decade later and remained more democratic than the general population, even after accounting for demographics. So yeah, we already know that public opinion on protests isn't actually the best way to figure out whether or not those protests are going to be effective. But that, for some reason, did not stop prominent climatologist Michael E. Mann, who's famous for that hockey stick graph, from producing his own public opinion poll about the tomato soup protest. Let me be clear, I have a lot of respect for Mann, not only for his research on climate change, but also for his standing up to climate change deniers for decades and continuing to engage in public outreach despite being almost constantly under attack from the fossil fuel industry and their legions. That said, this poll is bad and he should feel bad. As I've shown pretty clearly, even if a poll found that a majority of people disliked the soup protest, even if they said they were now more willing to shove plastic bottles into dolphins' blowholes, that is not a meaningful metric to determine the actual effectiveness of a protest. However, this poll didn't even do that. I honestly think it could have, but it was too poorly designed to do even that much. For instance, question 1 was, to raise awareness of the need to address climate change, some advocates have engaged in disruptive, nonviolent actions, including shutting down morning commuter traffic and damaging pieces of art. Do such actions decrease your support for efforts to address climate change, increase your support for efforts to address climate change, or not affect your support one way or another? A few issues with this. First of all, it already frames these protests as disruptive, which is going to bias people against them. It also lumps in the art protest with shutting down morning commuter traffic, a completely separate protest that people might find more or less off-putting than soup on a piece of art. And finally, it falsely states that one action is damaging pieces of art. That's not true. That didn't happen. All of those things are going to inflate the number of people who are turned off. It's really weird that that first question contains that outright lie about damaging art, because Mann clearly knows that that's a lie. In fact, he accepts that people might be unfairly biased against the protesters because of that lie, because he then makes an effort to determine if it matters whether or not art was actually ruined. He put out a second survey in which half the participants got the original question with the lie about art, and the other half got a corrected version reading, to raise awareness of the need to address climate change, some advocates have engaged in disruptive nonviolent actions, including shutting down morning commuter traffic and pretending to damage pieces of art. Do such actions decrease your support for efforts to address climate change, increase your support for efforts to address climate change, or not affect your support one way or another? That is absolutely not the way to test whether or not lying to someone biases them. Because you still have those other problems. You still use the word disruptive. You still conflate it with shutting down commuter traffic. Respondents might care more about the traffic than the art, so they might not even notice the pretending to to damage art. So it's no surprise that man found no significant difference between people who were asked about the lie and those who were asked about the truth. If you actually want to know if it makes a difference, you would just ask about the art protest. To raise awareness of the need to address climate change, some advocates have pretended to damage pieces of art. Do such actions decrease your support for effort, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as I say, I don't think that there would be that big of a difference because I think most people are actually angry at something else entirely. But I do think that there would be some difference. There are definitely people who were only concerned about the artwork. Plus, lying about the Van Gogh being damaged will absolutely take those angry for other reasons people and fire them up even more. One other issue I have with this survey is found in this big gray no effect bar. Personally, if I were polled for this, I would have been in that group. I understand that climate change is real and is a serious threat to humanity, and there is absolutely nothing an activist could do to change that. Seriously, soup on a painting, climate change is still real and destroying us. Hand glued to a wall, climate change is still real and destroying us. Kidnapping an oil executive and waterboarding him in front of his family, based, and also climate change is still real and effective. I am at peak support for efforts to address climate change, and nothing any random individual does is going to make me care less. Nothing is going to make me care less short of an apocalyptic asteroid on a collision course with Earth due sometime next fall. I guess at that point, I'd stop worrying about 50 years in the future. But man didn't bother to gauge respondents' existing support for climate change action, so we have no idea if the people whose support fell were already climate change deniers, meaning doesn't matter much anyway. We don't know if the no effect group are all in like I am, meaning that the protest didn't negatively affect the existing base, which is a good thing. And we don't know if that 13% of people who said these protests increased their support were already mostly supportive, or if they were previously ambivalent or even climate change deniers, at which point this was maybe a good success. One random person being more supportive and one random person being less supportive doesn't really mean anything without context. As of this recording, man is kind of losing it on Twitter. He's really insisting that this survey proves something about the relative effectiveness of throwing soup on a Van Gogh. It's understandable because I think man does good work in his own field, which is climatology, not public relations or sociology. So he's probably not accustomed to being corrected by people who actually know what they're talking about, and in fact, know more than him. I hope he is able to take a step back and realize that he stepped out of his lane and did some bad science with a dash of bad understanding of history thrown in. A well-designed survey could certainly find that people largely were turned off by this protest, but the people who study movements and social change understand that protests, nonviolent, disruptive, outright violent, they might work or they might not work regardless of whether or not you like it.